Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to do an If You Like This, You Should Read That fantasy edition. I've done videos like this before for both horror as well as science fiction, so I'm going to have those linked in the cards and description box. But I wanted to do this for adult fantasy, and I think I have some good pairings here. I love filming these videos, I love watching these videos, so hopefully you do too. If you're new to my channel, I do read a lot of adult fantasy, science fiction, as well as horror and thrillers, so hopefully you stick around. But let's get started. First, let's talk about books to read if you enjoyed A Song of Ice and Fire by George R. Martin, whether it be the books or the TV show A Game of Thrones. And I think that this one has a lot of love despite how HBO decided to end it all. But I think for a lot of people, including myself, I read the books that were published and then I was trying to figure out what to read next. And so I actually have 3 different recommendations depending on which aspects of this book you particularly enjoyed. So first up, we have Seven Deaths of an Empire by G.R. Matthews. And this is a story set in a secondary world where there is an emperor. Right at the beginning of the story, the emperor dies. And so the story is about both the general and then someone out in the field, a magician, that are trying to make sure that the proper heir to the throne succeeds and that the succession happens as it should. Now, I want to recommend this one because of the obvious fact that it is kind of that Game of Thrones where you have different people vying for power when there is a deceased leader that is an opportunity or weakness where someone else can sweep in and try to steal the throne. And so if you really like the setup of Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire, I think that this one will appeal to you. And I want to recommend this for people that perhaps like the idea of the Song of Ice and Fire series, love the TV show, but maybe found the books a bit intimidating. There, of course, is tons of characters, tons of world building. It's very detailed, it's very long. And so this instead is currently a standalone, at least as I'm recording this. And this is a book that's only told in 2 perspectives. So we get a general who is at the capital and also a magician who is out in the field. And he is responsible for taking home a very important object that is important to make sure that the next ruler comes to pass. And so I thought this one was very easy to follow. It doesn't have a lot of magic. You get, of course, a bit with the magicians, but it's very easily explained. And so I find this one to be very accessible. So you take the story or the premise of A Song of Ice and Fire and then you put it in a nice small package. Small being relative, it's still a large book, but it's again only one at this time. And so I definitely recommend this one for those of you that really just like that story and are just wanting to see it played out in a slightly different way with some good twists and turns and deception. The next one I want to recommend is The Traitor Baruch Cormorant by Seth Dickinson, and this is the start of a series that follows a young woman whose country has been taken over by an invading empire, and rather than taking over with swords and battles, they basically do a cultural takeover, and so all of her cultural beliefs are taken away from her. She's sent through an education system that is not her own, and so she decides to take revenge at one point when her family is torn apart by this. And so she actually goes about becoming a high-level accountant in this society and decides to take it down from the inside. So this is a book I recommend for fans for a few different reasons. One being the fact that it's very cutthroat. The characters are not likable. They do some really terrible things at different points in time. It's also very detailed. So if you love a story that, just requires a little bit more attention and just your time with a story, I really like this one. It does not pull any punches and it really grabbed my attention and is just again about terrible people doing terrible things. And so if that's an aspect of A Song of Ice and Fire that really appealed to you, I think that you'll really connect with this one. If you're looking for really nice, likable characters that you can become friends with, you won't necessarily find it here. And my final recommendation is for The Grace of King by Ken Liu, which is the first book in the Dandelion Dynasty series. This is set in a secondary world that essentially is like our historical China, and it follows multiple perspectives, but primarily following one, a young man who leads a rebellion to take over the empire. This is one that I think will appeal to A Song of Ice and Fire readers for several reasons. One being the fact that it's much more of a sweeping scale. So in terms of the plot, plot and characters. There are so many points of view. We move all over the map and we have lots of time jumps. And so if you really like the scale of A Song of Ice and Fire, this one will definitely appeal to you. Like in those books, you do get a lot of twists and turns, some deception, some traitors and backstabbing and all of that. So you do get a lot of that. I'd say less so in, say, the second book. It is a little bit quieter and less a story of war, but you still get those elements and they're very well played out. The character work is fantastic. You get a surprising amount of character development despite the fact that you're with so many different points of view at different points in time. But again, if you love the world building of A Song of Ice and Fire, if you want to see not just a very intimate perspective on a war, but getting to see it from different angles, this one might really appeal to you. I personally absolutely love it. Now, speaking of the Dandelion Dynasty, I want to recommend a book that is similar to that, but also a really good comparison for those of you that love The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang, the first book in the Poppy War series, a series that I absolutely love. And the Poppy War, if you're not familiar with it, is about a young orphan girl who gets into a military school. The first part of the first book follows her learning about the magic, and then partway through, war breaks out and she has to use her military prowess in order to survive, and the story turns into a very grimdark fantasy story about survival and a woman rising from poverty into the ranks of this army. I don't want to give away too much of the plot. I think everyone just about knows it. It is so beloved, and I know when I finished out the trilogy, I was dying for more. And so I am happy that I have a book that again has similarities to both the Dandelion Dynasty and the Poppy War. The book that I want to recommend is the first book in this new series, She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. And this follows a young girl who, right at the beginning of the story, her father and brother are killed, and she decides to take on the identity of her brother in order to survive. There is a prophecy that has said that her brother was supposed to go on and do amazing things, and that same prophecy said that she was going to have nothing happen to her. And so she decides to take on his destiny, and she goes off to embark and go to a monastery where he was going to be sent off to. And so she learns and trains and works with them. And then partway through the story, there is a narrative shift and it moves on to more of a war story, and there are multiple points of view that are introduced. Now, I want to recommend this one for fans of the Dandelion Dynasty because of the fact that it has that sweeping scale where you have multiple points of view in a military setting where there is rebellion and unrest. And also, of course, it has the setting of a world that is very similar to ancient China, which is a setting I absolutely love. And I also think it has a lot of crossover appeal for those that love the Poppy Wars. Rin, the main character in that, is not very likable, and I would argue that this character is perhaps a little bit more likable, but she also makes some really tough decisions. She is not a Mary Sue or a good girl necessarily, and so you do see her make some very difficult, selfish choices in order to protect herself. She puts other people in danger. And I think that there is a lot of appeal between these two characters, very much a rags to not necessarily riches, but to gaining power. And in this first book, the character is hungry for power. They want to secure their place and keep themselves safe, protect their hidden identity, of course, being a girl in a male world. This book is fairly low in terms of the scale of the magic. The main character can see ghosts, but otherwise there isn't a lot of that in here. So like the Dandelion Dynasty, it's not very heavy on the magic system. I would say there's a lot more magic in the Poppy War, at least in the later books. So it just depends again on what elements appeal to you most. But I definitely think that this book is worth reading. It is very similar, but also very much its own. And I highly recommend it. It's the first in, again, a series, and it's just well worth your time. Next up, I want to recommend a book for those of you that love The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, the first book in his trilogy, The Kingkiller Chronicles. And this essentially is a coming of age story of a young man. His story is told told over 3 nights in an inn, basically recounting how he got this infamous title. And so for those of you that love the series and are impatiently waiting for the 3rd book to come out, I want to recommend Sufficiently Advanced Magic by Andrew Rowe. And this follows a young man who at the beginning of the story goes through a tower in order to get his magical abilities and to get entrance into the magical schools. And once he gets through that, he then goes off to learn about the school. And of course, as you would expect, there is actually a larger story going on. There's a lot of political unrest that is happening in the background that slowly slides into the plot as the story goes on. Now, I'm going to cautiously recommend this one, knowing that it's not exactly the same, but I think it has a lot of crossover appeal. I know for a lot of people who specifically like the first book, The Name of the Wind, it's the fact that so much of that book takes place in a magical school. And in terms of books, certainly there's tons I could recommend, but Sufficiently Advanced Magic had a really similar feel in terms of the school setting. Both books spend a lot of time in the classroom, and you do get a lot of information about how the magic works, a lot of time spent with very goofy or unusual professors. And so if you like those interactions, I think that this book will appeal to you as well. A lot of people's criticism is that Quoth, the main character in The Name of the Wind, is very unlikable because he is brilliant at everything. The main character in Sufficiently Advanced Magic is also very talented, but while he has his talents, I like the fact that he has also anxiety and isn't always necessarily confident in his abilities. And so I do like the fact that it kind of counterbalances the fact that he is very talented. So if that was a criticism of yours, you might actually enjoy those aspects. In terms of scale or prose, I don't think the books are entirely comparable, but there is a lot of overlap for sure. And I do want to mention that if you're an audiobook fan, both books are narrated by Nick Podell, so that kind of gives them a similar feel as well. Highly recommend. Next, I want to recommend a book for those of you that love Eye of the World by Robert Jordan, the first book in the Wheel of Time series. This is a very classic, beloved series that is very long, and I've only read the first book, I will admit, but essentially it follows a young farm boy who gets sent off on a quest. He is potentially the chosen one, and it's a very classic fantasy story filled with classic fantasy tropes. Now, if you are a fan of that series, or at least are intrigued to try it but are a bit intimidated by the length, I want to recommend a fantasy trilogy that is a little easier to get into. The first book being The Shadow of What Is Lost by James Islington. And this has a very similar setup. It follows a group of young people that at the beginning of the story get sent off on a quest. They go along with their friends, and of course a larger story ensues. I'll admit I was not a huge fan of the Wheel of Time series, or at least the first book, just simply the fact that it's not to my taste. I really do not enjoy very classic tropey fantasy. And I also did not completely love The Shadow of What Was Lost because of the fact that it was also very tropey. But I saw a lot of similarities between the two books, and I know I'm not the only one who's made this comparison. So if you are a fan of the one, I do recommend trying the other. Keep in mind, of course, that the trilogy is not going to be at the epic scale of Robert Jordan, and probably not really at the level in the later books. But again, if you're just looking for something similar, if you just love the chosen one trope, this is an excellent one to pick up, and hopefully you will enjoy it quite a bit. And finally, I want to end out the video by recommending a book that is similar to Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson, the first book in the Mistborn trilogy. This is set in a world where the evil emperor has won at the beginning of the story, and so the story actually follows a few different perspectives, particularly a young girl named Vin who is pulled into a rebellion trying to fight against the evil empire. She learns that she has magical abilities. She learns about the magic system that is all centered around consuming metals and having different abilities depending on which person you are and which abilities you have. And the story is so beloved. I think most people know it. It's a booktube darling. But I want to recommend a book that to me had a similar feel, or specifically a similar feel in terms of the magic system. And the book that I want to recommend is Foundryside by Robert Jackson Bennett. And this is a book that is about a young thief who ends up stealing a very important magical item at the beginning of the story and ends up getting pulled into a larger political plot. But I picked up that book when I was looking for more books with a hard magic system. I think most people will recommend Mistborn if you're looking for a very satisfying magic system where there are specific rules and the characters explain them and the characters and the world all fit together, and it just feels almost very scientific in the fact that it's very exact and concrete and you know how everything works. And when I first got into fantasy, that was easily my favorite type of fantasy story, was the ones with these hard magic systems. I found it so satisfying and definitely appealed to the sci-fi reader within me. And so I was really pleased when I found Foundry Side, because it's a world that is definitely fantasy, but the magic system almost works like coding. So different people with the ability are able to set up code to give objects certain properties. So the example everyone gives is you have a cart that is rolling downhill, and essentially the cart thinks it's rolling downhill, but it's actually not. But by coding it or programming the cart to believe that, it allows the cart to move forward, essentially making it a moving vehicle. And so that is just a magic system I absolutely love, because again, it feels like something that is very precise. There are strict rules to it and the story follows those rules until the end, and I just really recommend it. So if you're looking again for a really good hard magic system that you're going to get a lot of information about, if you don't mind a little bit of info dumping, if it's done in a very nuanced way, I think that this one is fantastic. It's a lot of fun. And I will say that while both books are intended for adults, they definitely do both have that kind of YA crossover appeal. So if you like a kind of younger story, this one has that as well. Obviously, another one I recommend a lot. So that is it. We've made it to the end of the video here. Of the books I talked about, I'd love to know if you're planning on picking them up, or if you have different pairings. You can disagree with me. You can say that my pairings are terrible. You might have better recommendations. And if you enjoyed this video, hopefully you stick around and subscribe to my channel, and also check out my other If You Like This, You Should Read That video. And if you like it enough, maybe I'll do a follow-up with even more fantasy recommendations. If you enjoyed this video, remember to give it a thumbs up, share it around online on places like Twitter, Reddit, all of that. And if you hit the little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.